I'm honored to be part of the series and to be invited to share my experiences on this matter. If you don't mind, I will switch off the video and then share my screen for PowerPoint presentation. And then after the presentation, I can switch on the video. It's just that it takes less of the data. And so that's why I'm switching off for the presentation. So I will, before I start, let me just share my screen. So today I would like to talk about the timbre and the importance of timbre amongst the Nguni people, as well as how classification of sound could help us understand the way they structure their music, but also how the classification of sound could potentially help us understand how we could use that understanding in music that is beyond sort of traditional space, but also looks at how contemporary composers actually today engage with certain aspects of African music, but also the understanding of timbre in these societies. So I will be looking at two scores from my work as an example or a prototype that we could perhaps use as an understanding and a bridge between sort of the tradition and the contemporary artworks. The presentation of my presentation today is called Orchestration, a Functional Approach to Sound Organization in African Music. Before I go to the presentation, there are two elements of this title which I would like to explain and make a claim on how these terminologies are used in this presentation. The first word is orchestration. This word is understood as a group of instruments or sounds that combine to give one unified sound, and these sounds could be a combination of three or more different sounds. And so it's not specific to a particular instrument, it's not specific to types of instrument. It could also be electronic sounds. The same principle could be implemented in understanding those sounds. So here, when we talk about the classification of the orchestration, I do not necessarily mean the Western orchestra as we know it, but it could be a combination of different Western instruments that are more than one, or at least more than two instruments. And then you could have also a combination of Western instruments and African instruments. And the examples that I'm going to present today is actually a combination of different African instruments. And the reason why I'm using the terminology orchestration, it's because it deals with how the sound is organized, even though it deals with ensembles that do not have a standardized set of instruments like we have in a Western orchestra. So this is how I will be using the terminology orchestration here for this presentation. The second word that I want to elaborate on or clarify on is the word African. Though the word has connotation of implying the whole continent and diaspora, in this presentation, I specifically want to focus on some musical tradition from eastern parts of South Africa, and not the whole continent, simply because that would be too much to cover. And also the continent is too diverse to simplify in one theoretical framework that fits all. It's not possible. My analysis will not be looking at the sound of Africa as an ancient resource, but look at ways in which people have used some of the understanding I'm presenting to create sounds that are more modern. My presentation will then focus on how I have used some of these concepts in my own composition. Organization of the term organization of sound in relation to African music presents a point of disagreement to many people who believe they know African music. For several people, the first thing when we think about African music is the complexity of rhythms, the use of multi-tempos that run parallel, creating a network of complex interrelationships to pulse and so on. The timbre is often perceived as a byproduct of the instruments used to produce and present those rhythmic and complex rhythmic structures. Though we have had many scholars who have since questioned that and successfully argued that this is not the case with all music from the continent, this perception continues to be the focal point, even for musicians performing the music. This presentation is not about arguing for or against. Rather, it is to say that alongside all those other aspects that are associated with African music, there are some parts of the continent where timbre plays a central role, which is as important as the rhythm, if not more. We find a lot of examples in the music of Xhosa people. Some examples are also found in the music of Baganda people of Uganda and other parts of Africa where tonal language is used. Tonal language is when we have a word that is notated and spelled exactly the same, but understood differently based on the change of the pitch in speech. I have two examples here. Obviously, there are so many, but I've taken two examples from isiZulu, which is my mother tongue language. The first example is isibindi, which means bravery. And the second word to that, which is exactly the same, is isibindi, which is liver. And then the second example is ukusinda, which means heavy, ukusinda, which means polishing the floor with the cow dung. The use of intonation or pitch in the speech is critical because it can define a misinformation or at least a risk for the person speaking to be misunderstood or clearly understood. So the intonation forms a critical part of the communications amongst the Nguni people. The intonation is not only used in language, but also is central to some of the traditions that are found in Nguni people, particularly eastern part of South Africa. For example, we have people who are called Izangoma. These are traditional healers. They all have different ways of healing through connecting people with their ancestors. Some use bones of animals, some use water, and some use prayer. However, all of them, when they connect to the spiritual world where the ancestors speak to the living through them, their voice change. In general, their voice become distorted, darker, and husky. The example that I am presenting here is taken from a ceremony called Ogofemba. It's a very sacred ceremony that usually it's hard to find videos. So I was very lucky to actually get this snapshot, which just present the beginning of this moment. And you will hear when the person that you see in the video here, who's leading the ceremony, when she starts to connect with the spirit of this homestead, her voice changes, and she shifts between the spiritual world as well as the physical world. And when she returns to the physical world, her voice becomes normal again. Let's listen to this excerpt, and then I talk a bit more about this.
No.
Timbre is central to the way Nguni people communicate because of the importance of the tonal structure I presented earlier. Over and above this, I have also presented to you the importance of timbre in the rituals associated with the spiritual world. For the Nguni people, we strongly believe that we are guided by our ancestors through life. We give a lot of respect to the ancestors because we believe that their spirits are always with us and around us. So we have several ceremonies that seek to keep this connection healthy and protected at all times. We connect to the spirit through the medium called Isangoma, as we saw in this video. Isangoma uses the change of timbre in her voice to present a sound that shows her shifting between these two worlds. If sound and timbre is central to communication and traditions amongst Nguni people, it is not difficult to understand that this could also influence other aspects of their lives, including music. I would like us to listen to a recording of Oliver Tambo, a new composition by Latozi Madosini Mpahleni, who was born 1943 and died last year. She's one of the well-known musicians in South Africa and one of the few people who worked and encouraged the revival of the bom music in South Africa. In this recording, she is playing an instrument called Ohadi. It is a single-stringed instrument. The instrument is used to produce both overtone from which the melody is developed, and at the same time, it also provides the harmony, which consists of the filtered spectra from the overtone of the instrument. The filter is achieved by closing and opening of the calabash, which resonates the sound of the instrument. As you listen to this piece, I would like you to focus on the different colors created by the calabash. Notice how the performer controls the calabash and moves the body to achieve a variety of colors through amplification of the sound with the body that reinforces different parts of the partials or different partials of the overtone. I would like you to focus on the introduction, how the performer without singing focuses on giving an illusion of the melody through the change of timbre as an accompaniment. It also gives an illusion that the melody is resonating deep inside the instrument attached to her body. The structure of the piece is obviously very simple, which is a binary form where you have section A that has sort of a light and airy sound contrasted with a dark and husky sound or distorted sound. Of course, having listened to the first video, we now can associate the second or section B to the sound that we heard from Isangoma when she connects to the ancestors. So that is clear that the change of the voice at that moment is intentional, but also cultural within the aesthetic of Amaxhosa people. The composition shows a clear and conscious understanding of timbre as the focal point from which everything is developed, ranging from melody to harmony. However, I think that the pitch is only one of the elements that define the sound I hear and how the sections are contrasted, particularly comparing the introduction and section A of this piece. Listening carefully, we hear the light and almost metallic timbre that results from tapping the string with a small stick. Beyond that, we hear, we start to focus on the way the sound is produced, which allows us to hear this sort of metallic sound. We also take note of the material used to produce the sound and the resonator as well. All of these aspects combine to produce a specific sound that we associate with this particular instrument. Obviously, in orchestrating this sound, I will not only take all of these aspects into, I will take all of these aspects into consideration, including the pitch, but also how the sound is produced, because the way the sound is produced defines the overtone structure, the filter, but also the character of the sound. So I spoke about the beginning where you have a sort of metallic and also there's a kind of a rattle sound resulting from the tapping, and it's obviously if we change the type of string and we also change the type of the beater, all of these characteristics slightly changes and affect the overall sound as well. So in thinking about this character or timbre in relation to this instrument, the overtone structure as well as the melodic structure are only just the beginning. Part of it that forms part of the sound is how it's produced. Here I look at the material that is used. Sorry. I look at the material that is used, but also the type of the wave form. So we have a sharp attack with a very short decay, and a rather sort of light percussive sound. So in thinking about this sound this way, I'm starting to actually break down the different components that build up this particular sound. And if I can do that, it means I can possibly now allocate different instruments that could potentially produce each particular element in order for me to result with a potentially a bigger sound that is perhaps not necessarily anymore a duplication of the bow instrument, but is inspired by the bow sound and then created using other instruments. So this is generally for me a starting point in thinking about orchestration. So I have to break down the sound this way, and of course when I start to break down the sound this way, I start to understand that there are sounds that are in the four, and there are also let's say actually not sounds, but let's say parts of the sound that are in the four, and then there are also parts of the sound that are supporting, and then there are also parts of the sound that adds a kind of an aura to the sound. So here the aura are all of those subtle elements that give the character of the sound, but do not actually really interfere with the surface of the sound. Here I spoke about the sort of the sound of a rattle which results from the beta bouncing from the string. That in itself actually does not really form a part of the pitch analysis of the sound, but it adds the character that defines the sound as being close or far away from the bow or hard playing sound. And then, of course, leading up to this, then actually I look at what sounds are supporting or reinforcing the foreground, and then looking at the foreground as well, which will often actually include mainly the pitch, melodies, or whatever that is. So that in defining those three function, which could be more than three function, but for the sake of time, I just wanted to focus on these three particular function. Then we can now assemble different instruments based on the qualities that they give us in relation to the character that we've defined of this instrument. The example that I want to play for you here before I move on to or transition to my music is a composition by Dizu Plakis, who also is one of the well-known exponents of bow instruments. But here, Dizu Plakis used an ensemble to reorchestrate some of the elements that we find in a bow sound, in that way amplifying almost and bringing almost slightly to the foreground certain cycles sound that we often are hearing as environment as opposed to being part of the character of this lovely instrument. So let's listen to this, and with this in mind, knowing which kind of instruments are focusing on the foreground, or at least taking the function of the foreground, and which instruments are taking the function of the background, as well as the providing a sponge for the sound. So I'll stop it there for the sake of time. But here we almost hear certain aspects that were not necessarily in the foreground in the music that we played from Madoseni. And if you listen in the introduction, whenever she sort of changes the calabash, you have a sort of a glissando that is shifting from one fundamental to the next. And here, these actually to reinforce those glissandos, you hear him right at the beginning, almost presenting just that element as a vocal part. And then you hear the rattles that actually I spoke about in terms of bouncing of the beater on the string. Here he uses a little bit of shakers to reinforce that rattle subtleness of the sound. So, and of course, I'm like the drums that are used, very little sort of bass drum, more middle ranges, but also with a very short sort of decay, sort of really drier sound. So with this, it brings me to now the second level in how I classify the sound. So so the first part was we looked at how the overtone structure affects the timbre. And then from there, we spoke about the use of a particular material and how the sound is produced, sort of the physicality of the production of the sound as a second layer of how to classify the sound. The third layer that I often look at is the idea of directional versus non-directional sound. This is not an invention of my own. It's an invention that actually French composer Marc Delbavie sort of created, and I took over from in a way from Fabian Levy, who presented this to me many years ago. And I found it interesting in how, of course, we perceive sound. We define sound as close or distance, or strong or weak based on the intensity that it actually has. If it has a higher intensity, we define that as a directional sound or close sound, and therefore actually it overpowers everything else that is surrounding. And then we define the sounds that are perceived as a reflection. So if I speak to you like this, you can still hear me, but my voice is no longer actually as powerful as when I was directly speaking to you. It's because actually what you are hearing are the reflections of the voice coming to you, making the sound non-directional. And this, we can classify a lot of orchestral sounds as directional or non-directional, but we can also classify sounds irrespective of whether they are an instrument or percussion instrument or even electronic sounds based on the intensities that they actually provide to us. And below this, you still will be using other characteristics of the sounds, such as, is it sharp, like, I mean, the attack, what kind of attack it is it blowing, or is it struck, or is it tap, or is it plugged? All of those things actually then allow us to shift and understand the structure of the sound, and therefore the function that it actually can provide for the surface of the music. Obviously, in music, the surface level is what we perceive the most, and therefore actually we generally appoint or give that surface level to directional instruments and use the non-directional instrument to support that sound. And below that, so weaker, even weaker instrument, then they provide more or less of the aura sound to give the sort of the sponge from which the music actually sits. So with this in mind, we could clearly now understand how these recategorize his voicing, even though he was using different instruments, but you will notice that those that were playing the foreground were much stronger and sharper, and clearly here the voice was amplified, so it's much stronger in this case. But you could hear also the voices that are accompanying that have been actually kind of like used in the lower register. You hear in the background the female voices accompanying the male voice in the front, and the register of the female voices is using its weaker. Also, the female voices are using their weaker register because they have to support a generally darker sound, which is not directional. It does not actually project that much. So we have to make sure that the accompaniment is even weaker than what we actually present. So it is possible that you can have the surface level presented by the directional instruments, but it's also possible that you can have a non-directional instruments presenting the surface level. All of that actually influences how we think of the functions of the three layers and the instruments that we are providing in those three layers. Okay, so I'm actually going to play just the beginning and then maybe the end of this piece called Cry Out. And then I want to actually also just jump a little bit to the second piece. And here I want to actually kind of like push us to the idea that what happens if we stop thinking of these musical layers as a sort of a hierarchy, and what if they are all in the same level? What does actually that brings us, and how does that actually affect our overall perception of the music as well as the texture? And this appears quite also a lot in sort of African music. The piece starts with again some of the characteristics associated with the bow sound, which is a combination of struck sound as a trigger, and then you have the resonance, which then amplifies the spectra of the viola. The viola is used as the main instrument, and then the rest of the ensemble is used as the accompaniment. And as the piece progresses, these textures of the beginning, we have the three elements allocated to each instrument, so either as a trigger or a decay, and the amplification of the spectrum. And then towards the end of the piece, these three layers are blended into one surface, meaning that actually we hear almost one sound, in a way more complex than the beginning, because actually at that moment we lose the perception of the individuality and then start to focus on the sound as a whole. But both beginning and the end are basically two sides of the same coin, because the approach in the beginning is that the elements are distributed. We still hear one object, but separated, right? Whereas at the end, we hear similarity of object without definition of individuality in terms of instruments. let me actually jump towards the end. So here we also hear a transformation from the dry sound, which are those sort of short percussive sound that we use at the beginning as a trigger for the resonant, the spectra. And we have at the beginning the use of sustained sort of warm sound taking the foreground, and the trigger almost used as a sort of a sub, not really a background, but below the surface of the foreground in any case. Towards the end of the piece, actually, that what was used as a sort of a background has been transformed to be the foreground. And when that does, of course, it means actually we get to an area where the sound has been filtered so high that we actually really hear sort of percussive a sound that almost don't have necessarily a pitch content, and all of the sounds are the same, so to say. So we hear the complexity of the ensemble as one single object, as opposed to different instruments that are playing together. And so that for me, that's how I have perhaps used the idea of thinking of the different functions that I associate with, let's say, these three layers that I spoke about today, which is the function associated with the foreground, which is actually really leading the music, and then the function associated with the background, which supports the foreground, and then we have the a lower layer, which actually supports or acts as a sponge and supports or give the aura to the space from which the music actually is resonating. And that has allowed me to be able to project at times sounds that give an illusion of a single instrument in a bigger environment, or a sound that actually kind of like is inspired by another sound that is not actually here. So it's kind of like reorchestrated. But in dealing with that, actually, I found it quite helpful to think of the functions associated with each musical layer and how the intensity of each instrument or sounds can fulfill the function associated with that musical layer. I think I will stop here for today and not play the last piece so that we have a little bit of time to discuss and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andile. Thank you, thank you. So we have about 15 or so minutes for some Q&A. If you have a question, we ask you to please use the raise hand function, or if you feel more comfortable, just feel free to type your question directly into the chat box, and our team of moderators will keep track of them and pass them along. So we open up the floor.
Okay, I have a question. Sorry, do you copy me on the other end? I'm having trouble hearing anything on the other side.
Yes, we can hear.
My internet is a little bit unstable.
We can hear.
Okay, all right. Okay, wonderful, good. So thank you so much, Dr. Khumalo, for that wonderful presentation, and to the organizers as well of this session. I had a specific about this topic that's of deep interest to me. I'm calling you from Ghana, where I'm at the University of Ghana, pursuing a postgraduate program here in composition. I'm a composer as well. And I'm actually very, very interested in orchestration as it applies to West African music and art music and traditional music as well. One of the things I'm grappling with here, and I'm trying to understand whether there's analogs, is do you have cases of larger ensembles in South Africa or in the SADC area, Southern Africa? And how do you think about, Andile, how do you think about the combination of timbres? So you focused a lot on individual timbres and the timbral changes, such as the bowed instrument like the berimbau. I don't know what the name of it is in South Africa, but with the shifting of the gourd, the different partials coming out, the various different instruments and compositions you illustrated, where there was a lot of discussion around individual timbres changing. Or the spiritual medium you spoke about, where the timbre of her voice changes. But how do you think about, and in traditional music, are there a lot of examples of sort of combinations of timbres having being very meaningful, and the use of combinations of timbres and different combinations being a very important part of the music? That's my question.
Thank you very much. Is it Onche or Onche?
Yes, that's right, Onche.
Okay. So thank you very much for the question. And yes, indeed, we don't necessarily have a lot of big ensemble works in South Africa and the SADC region, but we do have ensembles as well. I mean, like we have a pipe ensemble called Chikona, which combines pipes, singing plus drums. And then you also have a number of ensembles that actually combine drums plus xylophones. And in South Africa, sort of eastern part of South Africa, you also have different combination of the use of voice, but it's not as diverse as you will have, for example, in a Western orchestra. So we don't have that sort of variety. But there is an interesting way of thinking around this, though, and that is, on the one side, we talk about blending of sound in terms of how they fit in together. So in other words, for example, if I think of an orchestral sort of sound and I want to create perhaps a trumpet sound without necessarily without having a trumpet there, I could combine the different instruments that have qualities that are very close to a trumpet to produce or re-imitate that sound as well. That's one part. The other part is, of course, is that if we have a blend of similar instrument, we get to another level of thinking about music, and that is textural music as opposed to individuality. So a lot of the music from the South, you actually hear around that, the idea of textuality as a foreground, as opposed to the differentiation as we have in the Western orchestra. I don't know if it actually answers your question in a very sort of short way, but I should also say that if you are, I mean, like if you're interested, we could continue the more conversation on this, outside this perhaps, because I also have students in Ghana. So every Wednesday we have a seminar that we do online, which you're more than welcome to attend as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I would look forward to that. I'll reach out to you private.
Great. We definitely still have some time for questions, for some more questions if anyone wants to chime in. Yes, Robert Hasegawa.
Hi, Andile. Really great to hear your talk. I enjoyed this a lot and nice to see you again. This all makes me very excited for the book chapter I know you're working on. But my question is on materiality, actually, because I found that really fascinating when you were talking about the Matosini example. And I know when we talk about timbre, we often focus very much on the acoustics, so the sound, and not so much on the sources. I'm curious if that concern for the stuff, the materiality of instruments is transferring into your own music in a contemporary context as well.
Mm-hmm. I've been, first of all, I should say I've been very careful in trying to present the source of inspiration as directly as possible, because that presents actually another problem in where you sort of shift the music from having its own life into how well has it duplicated or simulated the origin, and that's not what I actually really want. So and of course the parallel to this, of course, we've had a number of new compositions, or at least sort of a political discussion around compositions that do not necessarily really present what people think is African, and then they define it as African just because it uses a title that is based in Nguni culture, or maybe it uses a djembe somewhere there, and then it's suddenly African. So I try to sort of shy away from that in thinking about how can we rethink about African music today in a way that actually builds its own sort of space, as opposed to simulating either Western or completely African. So there are elements actually that really comes through. The last piece that I was going to play is one of probably the closest actually I've developed, which really uses sort of African instruments as part of the timbre that define sort of the last section of the piece.
Great, thank you.
New question from Fabian.
I don't know if Andile, thank you very much for this wonderful talk, which was too short perhaps to have more. And you showed very well that of course timbre is very important in traditional African music, in the sense that what was lost in many European music is that the soni, or the timbre change, the sonical change, is functional and not only the change of pitches. So it means really the timbre, the change of the voice, for example. Could you go further? Because I know that you are very influenced by spectral music, by Xhosa music, etc. How do you use these functions of timbre in your own music, perhaps?
Can you elaborate a little bit more, Fabian, on your question? By the way, it's not so nice to see you again.
Yeah, no, just because you saw that this change of timbre can be functional, and it can be directional, non-directional. This woman singing, etc. And you put a very important aspect in many traditional African music, where where this change of sound can be a function of semantic, and where we forget that's not only the change of pitches, etc. So I wanted to know if in your music you have some techniques going in this direction. I hope it's clear.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Fabian. I think in my work, definitely I looked at how, so the basic concept has always been that we understand objects, particularly musical objects, based on what we heard before and what actually comes next, but more so what the environment actually entails that allows us to actually hear it in a particular way. And therefore, the change of timbre using one object, for me, actually has a much deeper sort of meaning. And of course, I'm like, it's difficult to say now without a specific example and overgeneralizing, because each piece is slightly different from what I'm dealing with. But definitely, yes, I do use that with the idea that actually when we think of timbre, it's not just the color, but it has a meaning and semantic of why it actually changes at that particular moment, and how does it influence the way we understand what has come before and potentially what comes later on.
Great. We have time for one, maybe two more questions. So first to you, Chidi.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, Dr. Andile, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Mine will be a kind of a short comment and question. I quite have an idea of your presentation from the traditional music perspectives, where in a culture where I come from, although it is not, this rule is not written down, but there are certain principles that guide the organization of sounds, even when you have a kind of the same kind of instruments. So we, in a nutshell, it simply says that a light sound must come before a heavy sound. So even if you are dealing with drums, or you're dealing with all percussive instruments of the same kind, you always have that in mind, that there has to be a dialogue between a light sound and a heavy sound. And that kind of shapes how the traditional practitioners arrange the music and orchestrate the music, even when it is not notated. But that apart, I'm actually particularly interested in the speech inflection or the speech fluctuation of African languages and how it affects the music. So which actually brings me to the question I want to ask you. How do you approach these dynamics that you've presented from the Nguni traditional music? How do you use these dynamics in composing vocal music?
Thank you so much, Chidi. First, I should say, actually, I've composed as little as possible vocal music in my repertoire. But I think that is actually very, very important in how we shade the text associated with the different colors of the register of the voice, in order to make that a clarity, but also to stay true to the original meaning of the language. So that in itself actually really affects the way we orchestrate certain parts of the work in a choir, for example, so that we stay as close as possible. Otherwise, actually, it kind of gives a sense of conflict. But the way I've actually kind of like used the voice in my work has been that what I analyze from there has always been orchestrated in an ensemble, and then the voice is left as a speaking voice in 90% of the work. In that way, it interacts in terms of the structure that the ensemble provides more of the tonal fluctuations of how to understand the text. and then the sort of the voice speaks. At times it works quite well, but I think there's still some improvement in that case. But it's not hugely unique, because there are other composers that have actually also tried to deal with that context. I think that's a very, very brief sort of answer to your question, Chidi. Hopefully I did manage to just briefly answer your question, which I think is much more complex than what I've responded.
Thank you. I think we have time for probably just one more quick question. So we go to you, Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you for this this really interesting talk. I was really struck by what you were saying about manipulating the size of the room by playing with some of these direct and indirect features of timbre, because it's something that I believe happens in lots of Western styles of music. And I'm interested in just your perspective. Well, first of all, technically, how you do that in your music, how if you play with this as a parameter between near and far, and what how you achieve it technically, and to what, let's say, structural or expressive purposes you use it as in your work.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think first of all, obviously it depends from piece to piece, but I think one is you have characteristics that you define as directional. And here I'm not necessarily talking about the dynamic, because the dynamic is always the obvious one, but there are certain characteristics that are associated with the directionality. For example, the clarity, the sharpness, and all of those are very associated with direct sound. The opposite of that, of course, will be more of a non-directional sound. So you start to think of the different sounds that each instrument can potentially produce, keeping in mind that each instrument can act as a directional instrument, but it also can act as a non-directional instrument. So it depends on the different sound that you're working with, in how you then classify it as non-directional, based on the criteria that we perceive the sound as closer or far.
Okay, so specifically then with the what you called those the aura sounds, whereas the rattling on the string you would not be able to hear unless you were close up, so you can emphasize that, and suddenly you're in your space becomes closer, you lose that, and the space becomes broader.
Yeah. So let's say, for example, the violin, which actually the piece I played is a good example. Maybe it's not really good because you were hearing it from the speakers, which is different from hearing it live. But what happens is that actually, if the sound is just audible enough, but not loud enough for us to specify it, we immediately, the ear hears the sound in space. So it actually distributed as a kind of like environment, as opposed to the direct. So the more she increases the dynamic and the tremolo, then suddenly we're getting closer to actually specifying this is not only just the sound of a string, but it's a viola sound. So it actually becomes closer for us to identify where it is and where it's positioned, even actually in the stage. So that's playing with that level of audibility and recognition of a particular instrument allows you to spread the sound or give the illusion of a sound in space, as opposed to a specific sound. Obviously, you can do that with particular instrument, and with other particular instrument, you can't do that. For example, with brass, it's very difficult to do them because actually for them to produce a sound, they have to actually use quite a heavy energy to the instrument, and each start, it's clearly defined. So the flute is more possible. The clarinet is possible. Oboe is very difficult because it's by nature a very directional instrument. So all of the directional instruments are very difficult to produce as a sort of an aura sound. I don't know if it answers your question.
It does. It gives me a lot of a lot to think about. I'm glad. It's interesting to hear how you use that consciously in that way. So thanks.
Thank you.
Apologies to cut off such a lively discussion, but we're racing up against time, so I must end the Q&A here. But I'd like to once again thank Dr. Andile Khumalo. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, sharing your knowledge, your perspectives. Super, super thorough. I'd also like to thank the Actor Project for sponsoring our series, the University of Witwatersrand for lending us one of your best, and to all of you, the people, for coming out. Hopefully this presentation has inspired you to learn more about timbre, orchestration, traditional African music, the culture of South Africa, neoclassical traditional music, all things that we touched on today. We covered a lot of ground. If these things do interest you, I urge you to join the Sub-Saharan Africa and Diaspora subgroup of the Actor Project. Even if you're not a member of Actor, email myself or Josh or any one of the organizers. We'd be happy to have you working with us. Tour modules and other outputs from this series will eventually be available to both the public and members of Actor. We are happy to announce that actually 3 videos from the first 3 talks of this series are now on YouTube, as well as this series tour page. I believe Josh just put links to the most recent video as well as the page in the chat. But don't forget, our series is not complete just yet. Our next and final speaker for this leg will be Joel Roos Smith on April 3rd. So keep an eye out for details about that. But we are also in the process of planning the next leg of this series, which will unfold over the 2023-2024 academic year. There are still many Afrological perspectives on timbre and orchestration for us to learn from. So until then, once again, thank you, Dr. Khumalo, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great week.
Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.